The evening air was cold enough to make people walk faster than usual. The city lights were bright, reflecting off wet pavement after a light afternoon rain. Cars moved slowly through traffic, and people stepped in and out of restaurants, laughing, talking, living their ordinary lives. Near the corner of a busy street stood a young man in a thin coat that had clearly seen better days. The sleeves were slightly frayed at the edges, and one button near the collar was missing. His shoes were clean but worn down at the heels. He had the kind of face that looked both young and tired at the same time. Not tired from sleep, but tired from life. He had been walking for hours, not because he had somewhere to go, but because staying still made the hunger feel stronger. When he stopped moving, his stomach reminded him how long it had been since his last proper meal. Across the street was a restaurant glowing with warm yellow light. Through the wide glass windows, he could see families seated at tables, couples sharing food, friends raising glasses and smiling. A soft piano sat in one corner of the dining room, near a small indoor plant and a tall lamp. It looked old but well cared for. The keys shone under the light. He stood there longer than he meant to. He wasn't looking at the people. He was looking at the piano. For a moment he closed his eyes. He could almost feel the weight of the keys under his fingers. The smooth rise and fall of a melody. The steady rhythm that made everything else fade away. A car horn snapped him back to the present. He swallowed hard. He told himself to walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he crossed the street. The bell above the restaurant door made a soft sound when he stepped inside. Warm air wrapped around him instantly. The smell of fresh bread and grilled food filled his senses. It made his hunger sharper. A few people near the entrance glanced at him, then quickly looked away. His clothes didn't match the polished tables and clean white napkins. He knew that. He felt it in the way conversations slightly lowered in volume. A hostess near the front desk hesitated before speaking. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile polite but uncertain. He nodded. His voice was calm, even though his heart was beating hard in his chest. "I'm not here to order," he said gently. "I was wondering if I could speak to the manager." The hostess blinked, surprised. "One moment," she replied. While he waited, he kept his eyes low, not wanting to make anyone uncomfortable. He could feel people watching him, some with curiosity, some with quiet judgment. He had grown used to that look. After a minute, a man in a crisp shirt and dark vest walked over. His posture was straight, and his expression was careful. "I'm the manager," he said. "Is there a problem?" The young man shook his head quickly. "No, sir. No problem." He hesitated for just a second. He had practiced this sentence in his mind several times before walking in. "I was wondering if I could perform for food." There was a short silence. The manager stared at him, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Perform?" he repeated. "Yes," the young man said, nodding slightly. "I play the piano. I saw you have one. If I could play for a little while, maybe during dinner, I would be grateful for a meal in return." A couple seated nearby turned their heads openly now. One of them let out a small laugh before trying to hide it behind a hand. The manager looked toward the piano in the corner, then back at the young man. His eyes moved slowly over the worn coat, the faded jeans, the tired shoes. "You're a pianist?" the manager asked. "Yes, sir." Another small pause. The manager didn't look cruel. He looked doubtful. "We don't usually allow random performances," he said carefully. "Our regular pianist comes on weekends." "I understand," the young man replied quickly. "I won't disturb anyone. Just one piece. If it's not good, I'll leave." The manager crossed his arms. Part of him seemed annoyed by the interruption. Another part seemed curious. From one of the tables, someone whispered loudly enough to be heard, "This should be interesting." A quiet ripple of amusement passed through the nearby guests. The young man heard it. He felt the heat rise to his face. But he didn't lower his gaze this time. He wasn't asking for pity. He was asking for a chance. The manager let out a slow breath. Maybe he thought it would entertain the guests for a few minutes. Maybe he assumed it would be a harmless mistake that would end quickly. Finally, he stepped slightly to the side and gestured toward the piano. "One piece," he said, "and keep it short." The laughter at one table grew a little louder. The young man nodded respectfully. "Thank you." He walked toward the piano without rushing. Each step felt heavy, not because he was unsure of his skill, but because of what this moment meant. Pride had once been easy. Tonight, pride had been replaced by survival. As he reached the bench, he noticed small details others might not care about. The piano had a few scratches near the edges. One key near the middle looked slightly lower than the rest. The bench was steady but old. He ran his fingers lightly across the keys, not pressing down yet, just feeling them, testing their texture. Behind him, conversations slowly returned. Some guests clearly expected a short, awkward attempt before the manager would politely ask him to stop. The young man adjusted the bench slightly and sat down. For a brief second, he closed his eyes. The restaurant noise blended into one soft background sound. Plates clinking, glasses touching, a chair moving across the floor. His stomach tightened again, reminding him why he was here. But something else rose stronger than hunger. Memory. He placed his hands on the keys. Not yet pressing, just resting. The room did not know who he was. They saw the coat. They saw the shoes. They saw someone out of place. They did not see the years of early mornings spent practicing while other children slept. They did not see the long hours in silent rooms, learning how to make a melody breathe. They did not see the quiet sacrifices. To them, he was simply a hungry stranger asking to perform for a meal. A man at a nearby table leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, clearly expecting a show for the wrong reasons. The manager stood near the bar, watching carefully. The young man took a slow breath. He pressed the first key. Just one note. Soft, clear. It floated into the air, gentle but confident. A few heads turned, not because it was loud, but because it was steady. He pressed another note, then another. A simple beginning. Nothing dramatic, but there was control in his touch. A quiet understanding of space between sounds. The laughter stopped. The man who had folded his arms leaned forward slightly. The young man's fingers began to move more freely now. The melody unfolded naturally, like a story being told without hurry. Each note connected to the next with purpose. The restaurant noise slowly softened. Not because anyone asked for silence, but because something about the sound made people want to listen. The manager's expression shifted, almost without him realizing. This was not random playing. This was not luck. This was something else. The young man kept his eyes on the keys, his posture straight, his hands relaxed but precise. He wasn't performing to impress. He was playing the only way he knew how, with honesty. Outside, the city continued moving. Cars passed. People walked by without knowing what was happening inside. Inside, something quiet and unexpected was beginning to unfold. And for the first time that evening, the young man no longer felt the weight of hunger. He felt the weight of the piano. And that was something he knew how to carry. The first few notes were soft, almost careful, as if he was asking the room for permission to continue. His fingers moved slowly at first, testing the piano's mood, understanding its voice. The instrument was slightly out of tune in places, but he adjusted without hesitation. Years of practice had taught him how to adapt. A woman near the window stopped cutting her food and looked toward the corner. A child who had been playing with a spoon froze mid-movement. Even one of the waiters paused while pouring water. The melody began to grow. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried emotion in a way that made people feel something before they could explain it. The sound wrapped around the room, warm and steady, like a quiet conversation that everyone suddenly wanted to hear. The manager, who had been standing with his arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. His eyes narrowed, not in doubt anymore, but in focus. The young man's hands were no longer cautious. They moved with confidence now. His left hand built a deep, steady rhythm while his right hand painted something lighter above it. The notes flowed together naturally, as if the piano had been waiting for him all along. At one table, The man who had laughed earlier lowered his head slightly. He glanced at his partner but said nothing. The laughter from before felt misplaced now. The young man did not look up. He stayed inside the music. Every sound he made carried memory. Not loud memories. Not dramatic ones. Just small pieces of his life folded into each note. Early mornings when the world was still dark. Long afternoons when practice was the only thing that made sense. Moments of doubt. Moments of hope. His breathing matched the rhythm. Slow. Controlled. A soft shift happened in the room. Conversations faded without anyone asking for silence. It was not forced. It was natural. People leaned back in their chairs. Some rested their elbows on the table. Others simply watched. A server near the kitchen doorway whispered, "Is that really him playing?" Another replied quietly, "It has to be." The manager took a few steps closer to the piano, as if he needed to confirm it with his own eyes. There were no hidden speakers, no background track, just the young man and the old upright piano. The melody changed. It became brighter for a moment, lifting the mood of the room. A gentle rise in tempo gave the piece a sense of movement, like sunlight breaking through clouds. The child near the window smiled without knowing why. Then, just as smoothly, the music softened again. It dipped into something deeper, something reflective, the kind of sound that makes a person remember something they had forgotten. A woman seated alone near the back blinked quickly and reached for her napkin. The music had touched something personal. She wasn't sure what, but she felt it. The young man pressed a series of notes that echoed slightly longer than the others. He let them breathe. He allowed space between them. He knew silence was just as important as sound. He had once learned that in a quiet practice room many years ago. The hunger he had felt earlier was gone now. In its place was focus. Pure focus. His shoulders relaxed. His fingers glided across the keys with ease. Outside, someone passing by slowed near the window. The sound drifting through the glass was enough to catch attention. A couple walking hand in hand stopped and turned toward the restaurant. Inside, the energy had shifted completely. The manager's face had changed from polite tolerance to quiet surprise. He realized something important in that moment. This was not someone trying to entertain for sympathy. This was someone who understood the instrument deeply. The piece continued to build. The rhythm grew stronger. The notes climbed higher. There was power in his playing now, but it was controlled power. Not wild. Not messy. Every movement of his hands had intention. A man near the center table slowly put down his fork and simply listened. The sound filled the small space so fully that it felt larger than it was. No one checked their phones. No one whispered jokes anymore. The young man's expression remained calm, but inside he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Belonging. For those few minutes, he was not the stranger in worn clothes. He was not the hungry man asking for a meal. He was exactly where he was meant to be. His fingers moved faster now, dancing lightly over the keys. A delicate run of notes shimmered through the room. It was clean and effortless. Even someone with no musical training could sense the skill. A quiet gasp came from one of the tables. The manager shook his head slightly, almost in disbelief. He had expected awkward mistakes. He had expected a short, uncomfortable performance that he would politely end. Instead, he was witnessing something rare. The melody softened again, returning to a gentle theme from the beginning. Felt like a circle closing, like a story reaching its final page. The young man leaned slightly forward, his hands pressing the final chords with care. He did not rush the ending. He let the sound fade slowly into silence. The last note lingered in the air. For a brief second, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that holds meaning. Then, a single clap echoed from the back of the room. Another followed, and then the entire restaurant broke into applause. It was not polite applause. It was real. People stood from their seats. Some smiled openly. Others shook their heads in amazement. A few even wiped their eyes. The young man slowly lifted his hands from the keys. He looked around, almost confused by the reaction. He had only played the way he always did. The manager stepped forward first. His earlier doubt was gone. That was, he began, then paused, searching for the right word. That was incredible. The young man stood up from the bench, suddenly aware of his worn coat again, of the room watching him. Thank you, he said softly. The man who had laughed earlier approached him with an embarrassed smile. I didn't expect that, he admitted. You're really something. The young man nodded politely but said nothing more. From near the entrance, a voice spoke clearly. Where did you learn to play like that? All eyes turned toward the speaker, an older gentleman who had been seated quietly near the front. His posture was straight, and his expression was thoughtful rather than excited. The young man hesitated. I've been playing since I was a child, he replied simply. The older gentleman studied him for a moment longer, as if seeing more than the others could. The manager cleared his throat. You asked to perform for food, he said. Dinner is on us tonight. And not just dinner. He signaled to a server. Bring him a proper meal. There was warmth in his voice now. The young man felt a mix of relief and something else he couldn't fully describe. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. A reminder that his gift still had value. As he stepped away from the piano, several guests reached into their pockets and placed folded bills on the edge of the instrument. No one made a big show of it. They simply left it there quietly. He noticed, but he did not rush to collect it. For now, he was just breathing. The restaurant slowly returned to normal activity, but the atmosphere was different. Softer, more connected. The older gentleman near the front remained seated, watching carefully. The young man sat down at a small table as a plate of warm food was placed in front of him. The smell rose gently, and for a moment he just looked at it. Not because he wanted to delay eating, but because something inside him had shifted. Tonight had started with hunger and doubt. It was no longer ending that way. Across the room, the older gentleman finally stood up and adjusted his jacket. He did not clap loudly. He did not rush forward. He simply walked toward the table with calm steps. And the way he looked at the young man made it clear that this evening was not finished yet. The older gentleman stopped beside the small table where the young man was sitting. Up close, his presence felt calm and steady. He did not carry the loud excitement of the other guests. His expression was thoughtful, almost serious, as if he had just witnessed something important. May I sit? He asked politely. The young man quickly stood up out of respect. Of course, he replied. The gentleman took the chair across from him and folded his hands on the table. For a few seconds he said nothing. He simply studied the young man's face, not in judgment, but in curiosity. That was not ordinary playing, he finally said. Where did you train? The question was direct but not harsh. The young man looked down at his plate for a moment before answering. I studied when I was younger, he said quietly. At a music school. What kind of school? He hesitated again. Not because he wanted to hide the truth, but because speaking about it brought back memories he had tried to keep buried. It was a conservatory, he said. I had a scholarship. The older gentleman leaned back slightly. That explained the control, the discipline, the depth in the performance. A scholarship, he repeated. Those are not easy to earn. The young man gave a small nod. I practiced every day, he said. Sometimes before sunrise. Sometimes late into the night. His voice was simple. He did not speak with pride. He spoke with honesty. The gentleman watched him carefully. What happened? He asked. The restaurant noise continued around them, but their small table felt quiet and separate from everything else. The young man took a slow breath. Life happened, he answered. He was not trying to be mysterious. He just did not know how to explain everything in a few sentences. The gentleman waited. After a moment, the young man continued. My family depended on me, he said. There were medical bills. Work hours increased. I tried to balance both, but eventually I had to choose. He paused. And I chose my family. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet acceptance. I thought I would return to school one day, he added. But days turned into months. Months turned into years. The gentleman nodded slowly. And the piano? I never stopped playing, the young man said. Not completely. Even if it was just on borrowed instruments. Even if it was only for a few minutes. The gentleman glanced toward the upright piano in the corner. You played like someone who never left the stage, he said. The young man gave a faint smile. I've never really been on a big stage, he admitted. The gentleman raised an eyebrow slightly. You should have been. At another table, a few guests were still talking about the performance. Some were replaying short recordings on their phones. One person was showing the video to someone sitting beside them. The manager approached the table with a warmer expression than before. Everything all right here? He asked. Yes, the gentleman replied. More than all right. The manager looked at the young man. I owe you an apology, he said honestly. I didn't expect that. The young man shook his head gently. There's nothing to apologize for, he said. You gave me a chance. The manager gave a small nod, then stepped away to attend to other guests. The gentleman leaned forward again. Do you have any recordings? He asked. The young man hesitated. Not professionally, he said. Just a few old ones on my phone. May I see? The young man reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out his phone. The screen had a small crack near one corner, but it still worked. He scrolled through older videos and handed it across the table. The gentleman watched silently as short clips played. Some were recorded in small rooms with plain walls. Others were taken in quiet public spaces where he had found a piano. The sound quality was not perfect, but the talent was clear. When the final clip ended, the gentleman handed the phone back. You know, he said slowly, I work with a local arts foundation. We support musicians, especially those with formal training. The young man blinked. I don't understand, he said. I help organize events, the gentleman continued. Concerts, auditions, community performances. I have spent many years listening to pianists. He paused. And I can tell you this honestly, you are not just good. You are rare. The young man felt his throat tighten slightly. He had not heard words like that in a long time. I'm just trying to survive right now, he said quietly. And I respect that, the gentleman replied. But survival should not erase ability. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The food on the plate in front of the young man had grown cooler, but he had barely touched it. His mind was busy. Would you consider auditioning? The gentleman asked. The question hung in the air. Auditioning? Yes, nothing complicated. Private session first. Just a piano and a few listeners who understand music. The young man looked uncertain. I haven't performed like that in years, he admitted. You just did, the gentleman said gently. That was true, but this felt different. The restaurant performance had been unexpected. There had been nothing to lose. An audition meant hope. And hope could be dangerous when you had learned not to expect too much. I don't even have proper clothes, the young man said quietly. The gentleman smiled slightly. Clothes can be arranged, he said. Talent cannot. Across the room, the manager was speaking with a couple who were still discussing the performance. The atmosphere remained warm. Something about the evening felt special. The young man finally picked up his fork and took a bite of his meal. The warmth of the food felt grounding. I don't want charity, he said after swallowing. This isn't charity, the gentleman replied calmly. This is opportunity. The difference mattered. The young man looked toward the piano again. For years, he had carried his skill quietly, almost hiding it from the world. It had become something private. Something he used to hold himself together when everything else felt uncertain. He had never planned to ask to perform that evening. Hunger had pushed him through the door. Now something else was pushing back. Possibility. When would this audition be? He asked carefully. The gentleman's eyes brightened slightly. I can arrange something within a week, he said. There's a small hall we use for evaluations. Nothing overwhelming. A week. 7 days. Felt both close and far at the same time. What if I'm not ready? The young man asked honestly. You are ready, the gentleman said. You've been ready. You just haven't been seen. That sentence stayed in the air longer than expected. The young man lowered his eyes, thinking about the years that had passed. The quiet practice sessions. The moments when he almost gave up completely. The times when he wondered if music still had space for him. Maybe tonight had not been an accident. Maybe walking into this restaurant had been more than just hunger. The gentleman reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple card. He placed it gently on the table. "Call this number tomorrow," he said. "We'll set everything up." The young man stared at the card. The letters were clear and professional. This felt real. Around them, the restaurant slowly returned to its normal rhythm. New guests arrived. Others paid their bills and left. But for the young man, time felt paused. He picked up the card carefully, as if it might disappear. "I don't know how to thank you," he said quietly. "By showing up," the gentleman replied. He stood from the table, adjusting his jacket once more. "One more thing," he added. "Do not doubt yourself between now and then. Doubt is louder than any audience." With that, he gave a small nod and walked toward the exit. The young man remained seated, holding the card in his hand. A week ago, he had been invisible. Tonight, someone had seen him. Not the coat, not the hunger, but the music. He finally finished his meal slowly, letting the warmth settle inside him. When he stood up to leave, the manager approached once more. "You're welcome here any time," he said sincerely. "Thank you," the young man replied. As he stepped back out into the cool night air, the city felt different. The same lights, the same traffic, the same noise. But inside him, something had shifted. He slipped the card safely into his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he was not just walking to pass the hours. He was walking toward something. The next morning felt different from the moment he opened his eyes. For a few seconds, he forgot about the card in his coat pocket. Then he remembered, and his heart began to beat faster. It was still early. Pale sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of the small room he was renting. The room was simple. A narrow bed, a small table, a chair near the window. Nothing more. But that morning, the space felt filled with quiet expectation. He reached for his coat, took out the card, and stared at it again. The letters were clear. The number looked real. Nothing about it felt like a dream. He washed his face, trying to calm himself. He had learned not to get too excited about things. Life had taught him that plans could change quickly. But something about the way the older gentleman had spoken felt honest. After a few deep breaths, he dialed the number. It rang twice. A calm voice answered. He introduced himself carefully and mentioned the restaurant performance. There was a short pause, then recognition. "Yes," the voice said warmly. "We were expecting your call." They arranged a private audition for the end of the week. A small hall, a grand piano, a few listeners from the foundation. Nothing public, just a chance to be heard properly. When the call ended, he sat quietly on the edge of the bed. It was real. For the next few days, he returned to the one place that had always grounded him: practice. He found a small community center that allowed musicians to use their piano during quiet hours. The instrument was not perfect, but it was enough. Each day he practiced with focus, not to impress anyone, but to reconnect with the discipline he once lived by. His fingers felt stronger with each session. The speed returned naturally. The control was still there. Muscle memory had not forgotten. But something else had changed. This time he was not practicing for grades, not for teachers, not for competitions. He was practicing for himself. At night, doubt tried to whisper in his mind. What if the restaurant performance had just been a lucky moment? What if he disappointed them? What if he no longer belonged in that world? He pushed those thoughts aside by sitting at the piano again and letting the sound answer for him. On the day of the audition, he woke up before sunrise. He did not sleep much the night before. He carefully chose the cleanest clothes he had. They were still simple but pressed neatly. He polished his shoes as best as he could. When he stepped outside, the air felt sharp and clear. He arrived at the small hall earlier than necessary. The building was quiet, not grand or flashy, just solid and well kept. Inside, soft lights glowed along the hallway. A woman at the front desk greeted him politely and guided him toward the performance room. When he entered, he saw it. A grand piano stood at the center of the room under warm lights. For a moment he simply looked at it. The polished surface reflected the ceiling. The lid was raised. The keys were clean and even. He had not played on a grand piano in years. The older gentleman entered shortly after, along with 2 other members of the foundation. They greeted him kindly without pressure. "Take your time," the gentleman said. "We're here to listen." That sentence eased something inside him. He walked to the piano slowly and sat down. The bench felt firm, familiar. He placed his hands on the keys. The first note filled the hall with clarity he had almost forgotten. The sound was richer than the restaurant piano, deeper, fuller. He closed his eyes briefly. Then he began. The piece he chose was not the most complicated one he knew. It was one that carried emotion, a piece that told a story. The room remained silent. The notes flowed smoothly. His fingers moved with confidence, but also with care. He allowed the music to breathe. He did not rush. He did not try to show off. He simply played. As the melody unfolded, memories returned again. His first teacher guiding his hands. The long afternoons of repetition. The quiet joy of finally mastering a difficult passage. The music grew stronger. He let the sound rise, then fall gently. His left hand grounded the rhythm while his right hand carried the emotion. The listeners watched closely, not with doubt, not with amusement, but with focus. Halfway through the piece, something shifted inside him. The nervousness faded. The room disappeared. There was only the piano, only the music. He allowed himself to go deeper. His playing became more expressive, more personal. It was not about perfection anymore. It was about truth. When he reached the final section, he slowed slightly, giving each note space to settle. The last chord echoed softly through the hall. Silence followed. Not awkward silence. Respectful silence. The older gentleman nodded slowly. One of the other listeners leaned forward in their chair. "Do you have another piece?" someone asked gently. He did. Without speaking much, he began a second performance. This one faster, more technical. His fingers moved quickly, but cleanly. Every run of notes was controlled. Every dynamic shift was intentional. The sound filled the hall completely. When he finished the second piece, the silence returned again. Then quiet applause. Not loud, not dramatic, but meaningful. He stood up slowly, unsure what to expect. The older gentleman approached him with a thoughtful expression. "You haven't lost anything," he said. "In fact, you've gained something." He looked confused. "Life," the gentleman explained. "Your playing carries experience now. It carries weight." The other members agreed quietly. They asked him a few simple questions about his availability, his goals, and his current situation. He answered honestly. He did not exaggerate. He did not hide the truth. When the conversation ended, the gentleman spoke clearly. "We would like to offer you a trial performance at one of our upcoming events," he said. "A small concert, proper audience, proper stage." The words felt almost unreal. "A concert," he repeated. "Yes," the gentleman said. "And if that goes well, we can discuss something more long-term." He felt his chest tighten, but this time not from hunger. From relief. From gratitude. He nodded slowly. "I won't disappoint you," he said. "We're not asking you not to disappoint us," the gentleman replied kindly. "We're asking you to be yourself." When he left the hall later that day, the sky seemed brighter than usual. The streets felt lighter beneath his steps. For years, doors had quietly closed in front of him. Today one had opened. He knew this was not the final step. It was only the beginning. There would be more work, more pressure, more expectations. But for the first time in a long time, the path ahead did not look empty. It looked possible. That evening, he returned to the small community center to practice again. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to be ready. As his fingers touched the keys once more, he smiled slightly to himself. A week ago, he had walked into a restaurant asking to perform for food. Now he was preparing for a real stage. The world had not changed overnight, but his place in it had. And this time he was not walking because he had nowhere to go. He was walking towards something bigger than survival. The night of the concert arrived faster than he expected. The days leading up to it had been filled with long hours of practice, quiet thinking, and moments where he had to remind himself that this was real. The event was held in a medium-sized hall downtown. It was not the biggest stage in the city, but it was respected. The kind of place where serious musicians performed. The seats were arranged in neat rows. Soft golden lights hung from the ceiling. The grand piano stood at the center of the stage, polished and ready. He arrived early, dressed in a simple dark suit that the foundation had helped arrange for him. Fit well. When he looked at himself in the mirror backstage, he almost did not recognize the person staring back. The worn coat was gone. The nervous young man asking for food felt far away. But he knew that version of himself was still part of him. He touched the stage curtain lightly before stepping out for sound check. The hall was empty except for a few organizers moving quietly between the rows. The older gentleman stood near the front, speaking with someone. When their eyes met, the gentleman gave him a small nod of encouragement. He walked to the piano and sat down. The bench felt familiar now. The grand piano responded beautifully to even the lightest touch. He played a few scales, then part of one piece he planned to perform. The sound carried smoothly across the hall. Felt right. As evening approached, people began to fill the seats. Men and women dressed neatly, some holding programs, some whispering in soft tones. He stayed backstage, listening to the rising murmur of the crowd. His heart began to race. This was different from the restaurant. There would be no background noise, no clinking plates. Every person in that room had come to listen. For a brief moment, doubt tried to return. What if he froze? What if his hands trembled? What if he forgot a passage? He closed his eyes and remembered the small room he had rented. The long hours of practice. The hunger that had pushed him into the restaurant. He had already faced harder moments than this. A voice announced his name softly over the speaker system. Applause followed as he stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright but not blinding. He could see the first few rows clearly. Faces watching him with curiosity. He walked to the piano with steady steps and sat down. For a second, the hall felt completely silent. He placed his hands on the keys. The first piece began gently. The opening notes floated across the room like a quiet greeting. The sound was rich and clear. He let the melody unfold naturally, just as he had practiced. The hall seemed to lean into the music. He felt the nerves fade slowly as the rhythm settled into his body. His fingers moved with confidence. The music built gradually, rising and falling like breath. He did not look at the audience. He did not need to. He felt their attention in the stillness. Halfway through the piece, something shifted again. The same feeling he had experienced during the audition returned. The stage disappeared. The lights faded from his awareness. There was only the piano, only the sound, only the story within the music. When he reached the final note of the first piece, he allowed it to linger before lifting his hands. Silence filled the hall. Then applause. Not loud and wild, but strong and sincere. He stood slightly and gave a small bow before sitting again for the next performance. The second piece was more demanding, faster, more complex. It required precision and focus. His fingers moved quickly, but each note remained clear. The rhythm pulsed with energy. A few people in the front row leaned forward in their seats. He could feel the momentum building. The final section approached, and he allowed himself to push slightly harder, adding depth and power to the sound. The grand piano responded beautifully. When the last chord struck, it filled the hall fully. This time, the applause was louder. Some people stood up. He felt something warm rise in his chest. He had not just performed. He had returned. After a short pause, he performed one final piece. This one was simple, emotional, personal. The kind of music that speaks quietly but stays with you. As he played, he thought about the restaurant, the laughter, the doubt, the single chance he had asked for. He poured that memory into the keys. The melody was soft but powerful, a reflection of struggle and hope woven together. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for a longer moment than before. Then the applause rose again. This time it did not stop quickly. He stood, bowed once more, and stepped back from the piano. The older gentleman joined him on stage briefly, shaking his hand in front of the audience. There was pride in his expression, but also something deeper: satisfaction. Backstage, as he stepped away from the lights, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, from release. He had carried his gift quietly for so long. Tonight it had been heard. Several guests approached him afterward. Some complimented his technique. Others spoke about how the music made them feel. One elderly woman told him the final piece reminded her of her younger years. A young student asked how long he had been playing. He answered each person with humility. The manager from the restaurant had even come, standing quietly near the back. When their eyes met, he gave a respectful nod. The older gentleman approached him once the crowd began to thin. "You did more than well," he said simply. The young man smiled. "Thank you for believing in me," he replied. The gentleman shook his head gently. "You did the work. We only opened the door." They spoke briefly about future opportunities. More performances, possibly teaching sessions, even a recording. Nothing was promised overnight, but the path forward was clear. As he stepped outside the hall later that evening, the cool air touched his face. He looked up at the night sky for a moment. A week ago he had asked to perform for food. Tonight people had paid to hear him play. The difference was not luck. It was courage. He understood something clearly now. Talent can remain hidden for years, can be overlooked, can be doubted, but it does not disappear. It waits. He walked down the steps of the hall slowly, not in a hurry to leave the moment behind. His phone buzzed in his pocket with new messages. Some from people who had attended. Some from numbers he did not recognize. Opportunities, invitations, questions about future performances. He did not open them immediately. Instead, he stood still for a second longer. He remembered the hunger that had pushed him through a restaurant door. He remembered the laughter. And he remembered the first note he had played. That note had changed everything. As he began walking home, his steps felt steady. He was no longer walking to pass time. He was walking toward a future he had once believed was lost. And this time, he was not asking for permission to belong on a stage. He knew he belonged there. Months passed, but he never forgot the night he had walked into that restaurant asking to perform for food. Even as new opportunities opened and his schedule slowly filled with rehearsals and performances, that memory stayed close to him. It reminded him where he had been and how quickly life could change. After the concert at the hall, more invitations came. Some were small community events. Others were private gatherings where people wanted live music that felt honest and real. Each time he stepped onto a stage, he carried the same mindset. Play with truth. Play with heart. Do not try to impress. Just connect. The foundation continued to support him, helping him find steady work and better housing. He moved out of the small rented room and into a modest apartment with enough space for a digital piano near the window. For the first time in years, he had a place where he could practice without worrying about time limits or borrowed keys. But success did not make him proud or distant. If anything, it made him more aware of how easily talent can be overlooked. He remembered the looks in the restaurant, the quiet laughter, the doubt in the manager's eyes. He did not blame anyone for it. People judge what they see. And what they had seen that night was a tired young man in a worn coat. What they had not seen was the story behind him. One afternoon, he received a message from the restaurant manager. The message was simple and respectful. The restaurant was planning a small anniversary event, and they wanted him to perform officially this time. Paid, advertised, welcomed. He read the message twice. Part of him smiled immediately. Another part grew quiet. Returning there felt important. Not to prove anything, but to close a circle. He agreed. The night of the event, the restaurant looked just as it had before. Warm lights, polished tables, soft conversations filling the air. But this time, there was a small sign near the entrance announcing live piano music by a special guest. He arrived dressed neatly, confident but calm. When he stepped inside, the bell above the door rang softly, just as it had months earlier. The manager walked toward him quickly, this time with a genuine smile. "We're honored to have you here," he said. The young man shook his hand warmly. "I'm glad to be back," he replied. As he walked toward the same upright piano in the corner, memories rushed through him. He could almost see himself standing there again, unsure, hungry, hoping for a single chance. The piano had been tuned and polished carefully for the event. A small spotlight shone gently over it. Guests filled the tables, some aware of his story, others simply curious about the music. He sat down at the bench and placed his hands on the keys. The room slowly grew quiet. He began with the same piece he had played the first night. The opening notes felt different now. Not because the melody had changed, but because he had changed. There was strength in his touch, gratitude in his rhythm. As the music flowed through the restaurant, conversations stopped completely. This time there was no laughter, no doubt, only listening. He let the melody rise gently, then settle. He allowed space between notes just as he had done before. But now the air carried respect. At one table, a young boy watched him closely. The boy's eyes followed every movement of his hands. When their eyes met briefly, he saw something familiar. Curiosity, hope. After finishing the first piece, the room filled with applause. Real applause, the kind that carries appreciation instead of surprise. He continued playing throughout the evening. Some pieces were light and joyful. Others were calm and reflective. Between songs, he spoke briefly about the importance of second chances and quiet persistence. He did not share every detail of his struggle. He did not need to. The music told enough of the story. During a short break, the manager approached him again. "I owe you more than an apology," he said softly. "That night changed this place too. It reminded us not to judge too quickly." The young man smiled gently. "We all learn," he replied. Later that evening, he did something unexpected. He invited the young boy from earlier to come sit beside him at the piano. The boy hesitated at first, looking toward his parents for permission. They nodded. He made space on the bench and guided the boy's small hands to the keys. "Press gently," he said with patience. The boy played a simple note, then another. The room watched quietly as the young man showed him a short, easy pattern. The boy's face lit up as the notes formed a tiny melody. The applause that followed was warm and emotional. In that moment, he understood something clearly. His story was not just about moving from hunger to success. It was about opening doors for others. After the performance ended and the guests slowly left, he remained seated at the piano for a few minutes alone. The restaurant lights were dimmer now. Chairs were being stacked quietly in the background. He pressed a few soft notes, not for an audience but for himself. He thought about how easily he could have walked past that door months ago. He thought about how fear almost kept him silent. He thought about how one simple question, "Can I perform for food?" had changed the direction of his life. Not because someone felt sorry for him, but because he had been brave enough to ask. As he stood to leave, the manager handed him an envelope. "This is your payment," he said, "and also something extra. A donation collected tonight for young musicians who can't afford lessons." The young man looked at him with surprise. "That's generous," he said. "It was your idea," the manager replied. "You mentioned wanting to support others." He held the envelope carefully. Months ago, he had asked to perform for a meal. Tonight, he was helping provide opportunities for others. When he stepped outside into the cool night air, the city lights reflected off the pavement again. Cars passed. People laughed as they walked by. The world looked the same, but he felt different. He no longer saw himself as someone who had been rescued. He saw himself as someone who had stepped forward when it mattered. The journey had not erased the hard days. It had not erased the hunger or the doubt. It had transformed them into strength. As he walked home, he thought about the next concert, the next lesson, the next chance to play. He knew challenges would still come. Life does not suddenly become perfect. But he also knew something stronger than fear. He knew his worth. And he knew that talent, when combined with courage, can open doors in the most unexpected places. The restaurant door had once opened with a small bell and uncertain glances. Now, every stage he stepped onto felt like a door opening wider. And this time he walked through with his head high, not asking for permission, but offering something valuable. The music that once earned him a meal was now building a future. And he carried that future forward, one note at a time.